What if I told you a single film could bankrupt an entire Hollywood empire? Forget box office disappointments. We're talking catastrophic financial meltdowns that sent studio executives packing and left careers in ruins. These aren't just flops, they're industry-changing disasters that rewrote Hollywood history. The Lone Ranger, 2013. The Lone Ranger wasn't just a bomb, it was Disney's $250 million identity crisis wrapped in a cowboy hat. Johnny Depp as Tonto and Armie Hammer as the titular hero should have been box office gold, but this bloated Western became a legendary disaster that nearly killed Disney's live-action adventure ambitions. The production spiraled so out of control that Disney actually shut it down mid-development, only to restart with a slightly trimmed budget that still hovered around $250 million. Director Gore Verbinski created action sequences so elaborate that one train crash scene alone cost $10 million. The finished product was an awkward tonal mess, too violent for kids, too silly for adults, and way too long at 149 minutes. Critics demolished it, with The Hollywood Reporter calling it a bloated, misshapen mess. When the dust settled, Disney had to publicly announce a $190 million write-down. While Disney itself was too big to fail, the aftermath was swift and brutal. Studio chairman Rich Ross was shown the door, producer Jerry Bruckheimer's 20-year deal with Disney wasn't renewed, and the entire strategy for live-action adventures was completely overhauled. The Mouse House abandoned original blockbusters in favor of established IPs like Marvel and Star Wars. One studio executive reportedly said, "If you're going to lose that kind of money, it better have Disney princesses in it." The Lone Ranger became the cautionary tale whispered in budget meetings across Hollywood for years to come. Mars Needs Moms, 2011. Mars Needs Moms didn't just bomb, it obliterated an entire animation studio in 98 minutes of uncanny valley horror. This $150 million motion capture nightmare from Image Movers Digital, Robert Zemeckis' animation company, earned an abysmal $39 million worldwide and single-handedly convinced Disney to shut down the entire operation. The film's central premise, Martians kidnapping Earth mothers to extract their parental instincts, somehow managed to be both bizarre and boring simultaneously. The production relied on Zemeckis' beloved motion capture technology, the same approach that created dead-eyed characters in The Polar Express. Despite technological advancements, audiences still found the almost human animation profoundly unsettling. Critics weren't kinder, with Roger Ebert noting it had the creepiest humanoids I've seen in a long time. The timing couldn't have been worse. Disney had already grown concerned about Image Movers after their previous effort, A Christmas Carol, underperformed. They'd begun scaling back their partnership. But Mars Needs Moms was too far in production to cancel. When the film crashed and burned, Disney didn't just end their distribution deal, they shut down the entire Marin County-based studio, putting 450 animators out of work literally weeks before the film's release. The failure was so catastrophic that it killed Hollywood's enthusiasm for motion capture animation for years. The film's disastrous performance even became a Harvard Business School case study on how not to manage a creative enterprise. One former employee summed it up, "We weren't making a movie, we were making a very expensive tombstone." The Golden Compass, 2007. The Golden Compass was supposed to be New Line Cinema's Harry Potter. Instead, this $180 million fantasy epic based on Philip Pullman's controversial novels became the stake through the heart of one of Hollywood's most successful independent studios. New Line bet everything on this potential franchise starter, dreaming of 3 films that would rival Lord of the Rings in profitability. What they got instead was studio extinction. The production was troubled from the start. Director Chris Weitz quit, then returned. The screenplay was constantly rewritten to dilute the book's anti-religious themes to avoid controversy, which only served to anger both fans and critics. The final product felt neutered, too afraid to embrace the source material's powerful atheist message, yet still controversial enough to earn condemnation from religious groups. The Catholic League called for a boycott, while Pullman fans decried the watered-down adaptation. Domestically, the film earned a disastrous $70 million against its massive budget. International sales provided some relief, but not enough to justify a trilogy. The failure was so complete that it triggered a massive restructuring. Time Warner, New Line's parent company, had seen enough. Within months, New Line Cinema, the independent powerhouse that had created everything from A Nightmare on Elm Street to The Lord of the Rings, was gutted. The studio that had operated independently since 1967 was absorbed into Warner Brothers, losing 450 employees in the process. Co-founders Robert Shea and Michael Lynn, who had run the studio for over 40 years, were unceremoniously shown the door. One former executive called it the most expensive corporate suicide in movie history. Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within, 2001. Final Fantasy: The Spirits Within wasn't just an animated film, it was a technological moonshot that crashed so spectacularly it destroyed Square Pictures and nearly bankrupted its parent company. Square, the Japanese video game giant behind the massively successful Final Fantasy franchise, spent $137 million creating what they believed would be the world's first photorealistic computer-animated feature. The film took 4 years to make, with 200 artists working on 141 computers that required their own dedicated air conditioning system just to keep from melting. Director Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy games, was obsessed with creating digital humans indistinguishable from real actors. The main character, Dr. Aki Ross, had 60,000 individual hairs that were separately animated. The level of detail was unprecedented. Square even issued a fake magazine cover featuring their digital actress, suggesting virtual performers might replace humans. Critics actually praised the groundbreaking visuals, but found the story impenetrable and dull. Roger Ebert wrote, "It's the first film to convince me that I might live to see humans actors replaced by digital constructions." The box office return was catastrophic, just $85 million worldwide against that massive budget. Square Pictures, which had been established in Hawaii specifically to make films, was shuttered almost immediately. The financial damage was so severe that it pushed parent company Square toward a merger with rival Enix just to survive. Square's stock plummeted 54% in the months following the film's release. Sakaguchi, once the company's most celebrated creator, was forced to resign. What was supposed to launch a new era of digital filmmaking instead became a cautionary tale about technological ambition outpacing storytelling fundamentals. As one former Square employee put it, "We created the most expensive tech demo in history." Cleopatra, 1963. Cleopatra didn't just go over budget, it nearly drowned 20th Century Fox in the Nile. This legendary disaster starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton started with a modest $2 million budget that exploded to an unprecedented $44 million, making it the most expensive film ever made at that time. The production was cursed from the start. Sets built in London had to be abandoned when Taylor fell ill, forcing a complete relocation to Rome and a restart from scratch. Director Joseph L. Mankiewicz, who replaced Ruben Mamoulian after production began, found himself shooting without a completed script. Taylor's record-breaking $1 million salary ballooned further with overtime. Her torrid affair with co-star Richard Burton created a tabloid frenzy that overshadowed the film itself. The infamous production delays were so severe that Fox had to halt all other productions and sell portions of its backlot just to finance this sinking ship. When finally released at a bladder-challenging 4 hours and 8 minutes, Cleopatra actually became the highest-grossing film of 1963, earning $57 million. But this wasn't nearly enough to recoup the massive investment. The fallout was devastating. Fox posted losses of $40 million, studio head Spyros Skouras was fired, and the company teetered on bankruptcy. The disaster fundamentally changed Hollywood economics forever, ending the era of blank-check filmmaking and ushering in stricter budget controls. Producer Walter Wanger never worked on another major film again. As film historian David E. Thompson noted, Cleopatra didn't just cost millions, it rewrote the entire business model of Hollywood. The film finally turned a profit in 1966 through television broadcast rights, a humbling afterthought for what was intended to be the grandest theatrical spectacle ever created. Battlefield Earth, 2000. Battlefield Earth wasn't just a vanity project gone wrong, it was a $73 million sci-fi catastrophe that helped sink Franchise Pictures and became a punchline that follows John Travolta to this day. Based on Scientology founder L. Ron Hubbard's 1,000-page novel, this passion project had been Travolta's dream for decades. When no major studio would touch it, along came Franchise Pictures, a company that specialized in rescuing stars' pet projects that other studios had rejected. The production was cursed from the start. Director Roger Christian chose to film everything at bizarre Dutch angles, making audiences physically nauseous. The makeup and costumes made the alien Cyclos look like Kiss rejects with dreadlocks. Travolta, playing the villain Turl, delivered his lines with such hammy overacting that critics were genuinely bewildered. The script was packed with incomprehensible sci-fi jargon, including Travolta's repeated catchphrase about leverage that became instant fodder for parody. The reviews were nuclear. Battlefield Earth won 7 Razzie Awards, including Worst Film of the Decade. It earned just $29 million worldwide against its massive budget. But the real scandal emerged years later when it was revealed that Franchise Pictures had artificially inflated the budget by nearly $31 million to defraud investors through a complex scheme. This led to federal investigations, lawsuits, and ultimately Franchise Pictures' bankruptcy in 2004. The company's founder, Ely Samaha, was ordered to pay $121 million in damages. J.D. Shapiro, the screenwriter, later wrote a public apology in the New York Post, calling it the suckiest movie ever. Battlefield Earth didn't just bomb, it created a crater so deep that an entire production company was buried in it. The Alamo, 2004. The Alamo wasn't just a historical battle, it became Disney's $107 million surrender that accelerated the collapse of their Touchstone Pictures division. This bloated historical epic was originally set to be directed by Ron Howard with a $125 million budget and an R rating. When Disney balked at the cost and rating, Howard left, and they brought in John Lee Hancock to make a cheaper PG-13 version. Spoiler alert, it wasn't cheaper and the compromises made it worse. The production was plagued by weather disasters, script rewrites, and historical consultants quitting over accuracy concerns. Disney built a full-scale 51-acre replica of the Alamo compound in Texas, the largest set ever constructed in North America at that time, only to use it for a film that audiences completely ignored. The studio expected a patriotic hit in the vein of Braveheart. Instead, they got a ponderous, overlong history lesson that critics dismissed as spectacularly boring and dramatically inert. The box office performance was catastrophic, just $25 million domestically. Disney had to take an immediate $75 million write-down on the film. The failure contributed directly to the departure of Disney studio chief Dick Cook and accelerated Disney's retreat from adult-oriented filmmaking under the Touchstone banner. Touchstone Pictures, once Disney's outlet for more mature content, was essentially abandoned after a string of failures crowned by The Alamo. By 2007, Disney had slashed Touchstone's production slate by 50%, and by 2016, the label was effectively defunct. As former Disney executive Peter Schneider later admitted, The Alamo taught us that the audience gets to decide what's entertaining, not us. That lesson cost us about $100 million. Town & Country, 2001. Town & Country wasn't just a box office bomb, it was a slow-motion train wreck that took 3 years to crash and helped push New Line Cinema toward extinction. This Warren Beatty romantic comedy started filming in 1998 with a reasonable $44 million budget, but spiraled into a $90 million nightmare that earned an apocalyptic $10 million worldwide. The production became legendary in Hollywood for its delays, with filming stopping and starting repeatedly as Beatty demanded rewrites and reshoots. The script went through 11 different writers. Director Peter Chelsom was essentially held hostage by his star's perfectionism. At one point, filming was halted for 6 months because Beatty wasn't satisfied with the scene where his character wore a bear costume. Co-stars Diane Keaton, Goldie Hawn, and Gary Shandling reportedly became so frustrated that they refused to return for reshoots without substantial payments. When finally released in 2001, critics eviscerated it. The Washington Post called it the most vulgar, boring movie of the year, while audiences stayed away in droves. The film set records for all the wrong reasons. At the time, it was the biggest money loser in Hollywood history relative to its budget. The catastrophe contributed significantly to New Line's financial struggles, which culminated in the studio being absorbed into Warner Brothers in 2008 after a series of additional failures. Warren Beatty's career never recovered. He didn't appear in another film for 15 years. As one studio executive put it, Town and Country wasn't just a bomb, it was financial malpractice that should have resulted in jail time. The 13th Warrior, Niantin Nianti Niene. The 13th Warrior started as a historical adventure and ended as a $160 million funeral pyre that hastened the demise of Michael Crichton's directing career and weakened Disney's Touchstone Pictures. Based on Crichton's novel Eaters of the Dead, this Viking saga starring Antonio Banderas was initially directed by John McTiernan of Die Hard fame. But when test screenings went poorly, Crichton himself took over, essentially refilming much of the movie and bloating the budget beyond salvation. The production became notorious for its excesses. Entire sets were built, used briefly, then discarded. The crew spent weeks constructing a massive Viking village and ships, only to set them ablaze for one spectacular scene. The constant reshoots and power struggles between McTiernan and Crichton created a film with a severe identity crisis. Part historical drama, part horror movie, part action-adventure, and entirely incoherent. Upon release, critics were merciless. The Washington Post called it a muddled mess of a movie that squanders a talented international cast. Audiences were equally unimpressed, with the film earning just $61 million against its enormous budget. The financial damage was so severe that Disney had to take a massive write-down, contributing to studio chairman Joe Roth's departure. Omar Sharif, who appeared briefly in the film, was so disappointed that he retired from acting for 4 years, claiming Hollywood had lost its way. Crichton never directed again. Touchstone Pictures, once Disney's robust, adult-oriented label, never fully recovered from this and other late 90s failures, eventually being reduced to a distribution label only. As producer Ned Dowd later reflected, "We didn't make a movie. We made a cautionary tale." Titan A.E. 2000. Titan A.E. wasn't just an animated film that failed, it was the asteroid that wiped out Fox Animation Studios. This ambitious $75 million sci-fi epic from directors Don Bluth and Gary Goldman represented Fox's big gamble on capturing an older animation audience with PG-rated content. The film followed a young man in the year 3028 trying to locate a mysterious spacecraft after Earth's destruction. Despite stunning visuals that blended traditional animation with early CGI, the production was troubled from conception. Fox never seemed to know who the film was for. It was too intense for children, with Earth getting destroyed in the opening minutes, but was marketed with Happy Meal toys at McDonald's. The film went through multiple directors, with Bluth and Goldman taking over after original director Art Vitello was removed. The script was repeatedly overhauled, leading to confusion about the film's tone. Was it a serious sci-fi epic or a kid-friendly adventure? By the time it hit theaters, Fox had already lost faith, slashing the marketing budget to minimize losses. The result was catastrophic. Titan A.E. earned just $36.8 million worldwide against its massive budget. Fox was so alarmed by the failure that they didn't just cancel future projects, they shut down their entire Phoenix-based animation studio just days after the film's release, laying off 300 employees. Fox Animation Studios had only produced 3 films in its brief existence before Titan A.E. killed it. The fallout extended to traditional animation as a whole, with Hollywood executives concluding that audiences only wanted CGI films like Toy Story. Don Bluth, once animation's greatest independent success story with classics like The Secret of NIMH, never directed another theatrical film. As animation historian Charles Solomon noted, Titan A.E. didn't just fail at the box office, it convinced an entire industry that traditional animation was dead. The Adventures of Pluto Nash, 2002. The Adventures of Pluto Nash isn't just a box office bomb, it's a financial black hole that sucked $100 million into oblivion and helped doom Castle Rock Entertainment. This sci-fi comedy, starring Eddie Murphy as a lunar nightclub owner, had one of the longest journeys from script to screen in Hollywood history. Written in 1985, it sat in development for 15 years before finally shooting in 2000, only to be shelved for 2 more years as Warner Brothers executives tried desperately to fix it through reshoots and re-edits. The production was cursed from the start. Director Ron Underwood struggled with the massive special effects requirements. The script went through countless rewrites, losing any coherence it might have had. Murphy himself reportedly lost interest halfway through filming, delivering a performance so lifeless that test audiences thought he was deliberately tanking the movie. The studio spent a fortune on sets creating a lunar colony, but the result looked like a discount shopping mall in space. When finally released in 2002, The Adventures of Pluto Nash earned a cosmic $7 million worldwide against a $100 million budget. Critics were merciless. It holds a 4% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with CNN calling it a waste of time, money, and talent. The failure was so complete that it helped seal the fate of Castle Rock Entertainment, the once proud independent studio behind When Harry Met Sally and The Shawshank Redemption. Within a year, Castle Rock was effectively absorbed by Warner Brothers, losing its autonomy and much of its staff. Murphy's career entered a serious decline that lasted nearly a decade. The film was so toxic that when asked about it years later, Murphy simply replied, "I know the movie bombed, but I don't believe I've actually seen it." In Hollywood accounting offices, pulling a Pluto Nash became shorthand for a film with absolutely no chance of recouping its costs. The Fall of the Roman Empire, 1964. The fall of the Roman Empire didn't just chronicle a civilization's collapse, it prophetically enacted the destruction of producer Samuel Bronston's own movie empire. This massive historical epic, starring Sophia Loren, Stephen Boyd, and Alec Guinness, cost a staggering $19 million in 1964 and represented Bronston's most ambitious project yet. Fresh off the success of El Cid, the producer built a 55-acre replica of the Roman Forum in Spain, at the time the largest movie set ever constructed. The production employed 7,000 extras and used 35,000 costumes. Bronston's hubris knew no bounds. He constructed permanent buildings rather than facades, including a marble-clad emperor's palace that later became a tourist attraction. The battle sequences involved thousands of soldiers in custom armor. One scene alone featured 8,000 extras on screen simultaneously. The film's climactic gladiatorial combat lasted 12 minutes and took 3 weeks to shoot. When early cuts ran over 4 hours, director Anthony Mann was forced to hack away crucial character development to get it down to a still unwieldy 188 minutes. Upon release, critics actually praised the film's scope and ambition, but audiences had grown weary of sandal and sword epics. The box office returns were catastrophic, less than $5 million domestically against that massive budget. The failure triggered a financial investigation that revealed Bronston had been securing loans against the same film assets multiple times. Within months, Bronston Productions went bankrupt, its massive Spanish studio abandoned. Bronston himself fled to Switzerland to avoid creditors. The collapse was so complete that the term "doing a Bronston" became Hollywood slang for committing financial fraud. The majestic Forum set, once the pride of Spain's film industry, was left to decay for years before being dismantled, a physical manifestation of both Rome's fall and Bronston's shattered Hollywood dreams. Cutthroat Island, Niantic 95. Cutthroat Island wasn't just a pirate movie that sank. It was a $98 million financial iceberg that dragged an entire studio to the bottom of the Hollywood ocean. Carolco Pictures, once the powerhouse behind Terminator 2 and Basic Instinct, bet everything on this swashbuckling disaster starring Geena Davis and directed by her then-husband Renny Harlin. What followed was perhaps the most expensive act of career suicide in film history. The production was cursed from the start. Original star Michael Douglas abandoned ship early, leading to a desperate rotation of replacements before settling on the relatively unknown Matthew Modine. 6 writers cycled through the script, which underwent constant rewrites even during filming. The shoot in Malta and Thailand was plagued with disasters. Sets were destroyed by storms, crew members were injured, and a stuntman nearly drowned. Harlan, known for his perfectionism, demanded entire harbor sets be rebuilt when they didn't match his vision. When finally released at Christmas 1995, Cutthroat Island earned a pathetic $10 million against its massive budget, setting Guinness World Records as the biggest box office flop of all time relative to cost. Critics savaged it, with the Washington Post calling it waterlogged, bloated, and adrift. The failure wasn't just bad, it was extinction level. Carolco Pictures, already struggling financially, immediately declared bankruptcy. The studio that had revolutionized independent filmmaking was gone. The pirate genre was considered so toxic that Disney nearly canceled Pirates of the Caribbean years later until Jerry Bruckheimer fought for it. Harlan and Davis, once Hollywood power couple, saw their careers nosedive. Their marriage ended soon after. As producer Mario Kassar later reflected, "We didn't just make a movie that failed, we sank an entire studio with one film." Heaven's Gate, 1980. Heaven's Gate didn't just bomb, it became the nuclear explosion that obliterated United Artists, one of Hollywood's most storied studios. Director Michael Cimino, fresh off his Oscar triumph with The Deer Hunter, was given unprecedented creative control over this Western epic about the Johnson County War. What followed was perhaps the most legendary production disaster in film history. The movie started with a $7.5 million budget and spiraled to $44 million as Cimino's perfectionism reached maniacal levels. He demanded a street built to his specifications, then demolished and rebuilt it because it didn't look right, a mere 6 feet too wide. He shot over 1.3 million feet of film, sometimes doing 50 takes of a single scene. When a historical expert pointed out an anachronistic street sign, Cimino reportedly responded, "It's my movie. If I want a street sign, I'll have a street sign." The first rough cut was a bladder-challenging 5 hours and 25 minutes. After disastrous early screenings, the film was pulled from release, drastically recut, and re-released at 149 minutes. But the damage was done. Critics eviscerated it, with Vincent Canby of the New York Times calling it an unqualified disaster and the most scandalous cinematic waste I've ever seen. The box office was apocalyptic, just $3.5 million against that massive budget. The fallout was nuclear. Transamerica Corporation, which owned United Artists, sold the studio to MGM for a fraction of its worth. UA, the studio founded by Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, Douglas Fairbanks, and D.W. Griffith, effectively ceased to exist as an independent entity after 60 years of filmmaking. Cimino, once Hollywood's golden boy, became unemployable overnight. The era of director-driven filmmaking that defined 1970s cinema came to an abrupt end, with studios reasserting control over auteurs. As critic David Thompson wrote, "Heaven's Gate didn't just kill a studio, it ended an entire era of American filmmaking. It's hard to imagine a single film could destroy decades of Hollywood history, but these 15 catastrophic failures did exactly that. They didn't just lose money, they demolished studios, ended careers, and fundamentally changed how films get made. Which of these disasters surprised you most? And here's a question worth debating. In an era of franchise filmmaking and corporate caution, could a single movie still bring down a studio today, or have conglomerates made themselves too big to fail? Let me know in the comments below.